Okay, let's continue with aggregate demand. Okay, so what do we have here? Aggregate demand. We should understand that concept by now. Okay, so main elements of aggregate demand: consumption, spending from consumers, investment, capital investment from firms, government spending, that's the public sector, and net exports. Okay, revenue from exports, take away spending on imports. So let's take a look at one particular of those components. We're going to look at government spending. Okay, this forms quite a big part of aggregate demand, so really important you understand it. And the first major impact, okay, comes from this concept: fiscal policy. Okay, now fiscal policy is made up of two elements. Okay, the first one is tax, and the second one is spending. Okay, and let's think about this. Different governments have different priorities. We'll come to that a little bit later. But ultimately, some governments tax heavily and spend heavily. Some governments tax less and spend less. So let's take a look at some examples. If you go with a Scandinavian model, if you move to Scandinavia and you get a job, expect a very high wage, but also expect a very high tax bill. But the positive about living in Scandinavia is you have very well developed public services. So the government spending reflects the level of taxation within the economy. If you go to the United States and get a job, so all of you moving to Florida, you might want to think about the concept that you will need private health insurance. You will need to pay for your children's education at university, unless you get a scholarship. And you will have to pay for a lot of public services. Okay? But on the upside, you don't get taxed as much. Okay? So think about the balance. What is the fiscal policy of a government? Do they tax highly? Do they spend highly? Do they tax less and spend less? Okay? So the government policy in terms of taxation and government spending will have a direct impact on the level of aggregate demand. So imagine a scenario that Donald Trump does not win the 2020 election and you get a Democratic president in the United States in 2020. Okay, that president could, in fact, we've already seen Obama try it a few years back. That president could invest what we're talking about, maybe trillions of dollars into a public health service for American citizens. Where does that money come from? It comes from taxation. Okay? So don't forget, if a government taxes more and spends more, that is going to have an impact on aggregate demand. Okay? So that's the first thing to get your head around: fiscal policy. Okay? Now, next, the level of economic activity. Well, why does that have an impact on government spending? Well, for two reasons. The first reason, if you have more economic activity, your country requires greater investment in infrastructure. The ability to move things around and people, to move products and raw materials and people around your country. You need investment in roads, rail systems, airports, ports for boats and ships. So you do have to consider what is the level of economic activity. Economic activity is high, that might require more investment from the government, more government spending. Okay? The second concept is this: if the level of economic activity is high, that means consumers are spending more money. And if they're spending more money, it means that the government is getting more tax revenue. Okay? That's a good thing, but it also will encourage them to spend more. They've got more revenue coming in, they may well be able to spend more on public services. Other concepts are linked to unemployment. So if levels of economic activity are low, you're likely to have a lot of unemployment. Unemployment really has a damaging effect because the government has to support the poorest people in their society with what we call unemployment benefits or welfare payments. Okay? Also, If those people are unemployed, they're unlikely to be paying as much tax. And that will have an impact on the amount of tax revenue coming into the government. So let's just recap that. Levels of economic activity are high. We are likely to see more spending on infrastructure. If levels of economic activity are low, we're likely to see more spending on welfare payments, unemployment benefits. Okay, so there is a two-sided argument here. Okay, you must be aware of that, especially when you're writing longer answers to the 20-mark questions, for example. Okay, thirdly, correction of market failure. Okay, often a government's job is to step in to correct market failure. Okay, so let's give an example. The under provision of merit goods. Okay, let's just go through that. Under provision means they're not providing enough. Merit goods are things that the government deem to be good for society. Okay, if you ever get stuck for an example, think about fruit. Okay, fruit is healthy. Fruit is a good thing for people to consume. The government wants more people to eat more fruit, and therefore, what do they do? And what do they give to farmers that produce fruit? They give a subsidy. Okay, go back and watch the videos on subsidies if you don't understand that. So think about it. If a government steps in to correct market failure, they may have to increase spending in order to do so, normally in the form of grants or subsidies or tax breaks to help to encourage the production of merit goods. Okay. On the other side, the correction of market failure could be a government taxing demerit goods, which would mean that actually they would be receiving a greater tax revenue. Okay, they would actually be receiving more money from that market failure, from the intervention to correct that market failure. And actually, that might encourage them to spend more. Okay, so think about, again, weighing up the different priorities. Speaking of priorities, each political party, which is democratically elected normally, what we're suggesting is that some political philosophies would suggest a greater spending in the public sector than others. Okay, do some research. Watch the news. Okay, understand the US system. You've got the Republicans and the Democrats. The Democrats are left orientated, more socialist. The Republicans are more right wing, more conservative, and more likely to encourage the free market. Okay, a government that is left wing is likely to encourage intervention, whereas a government which is right wing is likely to encourage free market. Okay, so don't forget the political priorities of those parties. In the UK, you've got the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, left and right. In Spain, you've got the PSOE, which is left wing. You've got the Parti Popular, which is right wing. Okay, think about where those political parties lie and what are their priorities in terms of government spending. Some will spend more, some will spend less. Okay, right, don't forget, aggregate demand. Just one of these components can have a major effect on an economy. How does that work? Well, it works very simply, doesn't it? We've seen this before. We've got an equilibrium here. We've got aggregate demand here. We've got short run aggregate supply there. We've got average prices there. We've got output here. You know the labels. Get the labels right. Average prices indicating inflation or deflation here. We've got output across the bottom. That can tell us all about economic growth, levels of GDP, gross domestic product. So think about it. The government decides they're going to invest and spend more on education or healthcare or the police service or pensions or unemployment benefits or anything that the government spends money on. It could be something as simple as defense spending. Okay? What are we going to see here? Well, we're just going to see a very simple shift to the right in aggregate demand. Now that does three things. It creates a new equilibrium. Okay? It encourages suppliers to produce more goods. Look at what happens to the level of output. Okay? A government can create economic growth by spending money in the economy. Okay? Lots of government did it after the 2008 economic crisis, and they're likely to do it again after this economic crisis of 2020. So, what that also does, unfortunately, for consumers, it actually increases average prices in the economy. Okay, again, there is a trade off. The creation of economic growth on the demand side is likely to create demand side inflation. And we see average prices are increasing, which means that when I go to the shops, when you go to the shops, when your parents go to the shops, average price levels in the economy are increasing. Okay? And we'll look at a different section called inflation where we can actually work out how that's calculated and what the impacts of that are. Okay? Stay tuned.